Well, good afternoon and welcome. It is 12 noon, so with Michael's permission, I think it's time for us to go ahead and get started. My name is Kim Delaney, and I'm with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council. We'll be the logistical assistance for the first of a series of summits on road trespassing tools and funding solutions. Let's see, let's just go forward. There we go. The Regional Planning Council is a four-county agency in Southeast Florida, and we provide assistance to local governments, agencies, and the public on all matters, including rail safety. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you are welcome to send me an email at kdelaney@tcrpc.org, or give us a call in our office, 772-221-4060, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot through any challenges that you have. And so with that, Michael, I think the baton gets handed to you.
Yes, thank you, Kim. And I also want to say thank you to your organization, Kim. Without the support and assistance from your organization, the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, none of this would have been made possible today. My name is Mike Griskevich. I am part of the Federal Railroad Administration's Office of Railroad Safety. I work in the Railroad Trespassing and Grade Crossing team. Part of my job is I partner with federal, state, and local officials throughout the throughout the country to establish and implement grade crossing and railroad trespass prevention initiatives. Our team is based all across the country. We have roughly 30 field folks and roughly 6 to 8 headquarters folks that focus solely on grade crossing and trespass issues. My counterpart today will be Monica Shaw. Monica is a transportation specialist for the FRA. She's also involved in the trespass prevention program. She serves as a project manager overseeing Operation Lifesaver Grant. She also oversees the law enforcement liaison program. Monica and I are kind of co-partners in just about everything we do. Monica does hold a bachelor's degree in project management. She isn't saying she also holds a degree in nursing. So Monica has quite the extensive background, and she's been with the FRA for 34 years. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Monica, were you able to connect in? Yeah, Monica was experiencing some technical difficulties, so she'll join us shortly. I just want to talk a little bit of some of our housekeeping things. First of all, this is one webinar in a series of webinars planned looking at the Southeast Florida. Today, our topic is to raise awareness of the dangers and effects of railroad trespassing. Additionally, we just don't want to raise awareness to the public. We also want to make everybody aware of some low-cost solutions. We want to discuss some practical ideas that may include technology improvements. And lastly, probably one of the most important things is we want to talk about funding solutions. So today we will go over all that in a short amount of time. In the future, we will hold additional webinars. It is our goal, depending on the climate of the United States in a year, is to hold an in-person event based in Florida somewhere, most likely the Southeast area. We are looking for topics from you, the audience, for our next webinars. So feel free at any time in the chat to enter any topics you like, or you should have received a confirmation email from Monica. Feel free to email Monica any suggestions you may have on future webinars. We are here to we're here to help you. You're our customers, so tell us what you'd like to hear. Of course, lastly, during this webinar, if you have any questions, please use the chat box. Ashley will be monitoring our chat, and she will ensure that all questions are recorded so we can either answer them if time gives today, or we will reach out to you at a later date. As you heard earlier, this webinar is being recorded. FRA will post this PowerPoint along with the recording of this webinar on its website in coming weeks from the conclusion of this conference. Next slide, please. Today, you're going to hear from the experts. These folks that you see on the screen, they're the experts. They live and breathe railroad trespassing and grade crossing issues. So they're here to talk to you about the issues directly in Southeast Florida. But more importantly, we're here to talk to you about how to fix or present some ideas that don't take much money. They include everything from shrubbery to fencing, the whole gamut. So you're going to hear from all these folks today to talk about our issue. Go ahead, next slide. So our agenda for today, you'll hear from Mr. Mike Long. He is the Director of Operations at the FRA. You're also going to hear about FRA's national strategy to prevent railroad trespassing. I am going to talk some detailed about some trends. Some of you may be going, well, why Southeast Florida? Why are we targeting this area? You're going to be, the data speaks for itself. You have one county in Southeast Florida that ranks 4th in the United States for the most casualties involving railroad trespassing. So I really want to drive home that this issue is happening in Southeast Florida. It's your backyard, so we want to point that out. We're also going to talk about treatments, tools, and funding solutions. But more importantly, we're just not going to walk away after today. We're going to discuss some next steps. That's why it's very important for you folks to please chime in and put in the chat box any suggestions you have for future webinars. Next slide. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Michael Long. He's the Director of Railroad Operations and Outreach for the Federal Railroad Administration. Mike is responsible for safe rail operations as well as outreach to the rail industry, associations, labor, the community, just about anybody. Mike oversees several people at the FRA that are charged with ensuring railroads operate in compliance with federal laws across the United States. Prior to joining the FRA, Mike was part of the Short Line Safety Institute, and he returned back to us in 2018. When Mike was originally with us, he was a regional administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration. Mike?
All right, thank you, Michael. And first off, I want to say good afternoon and thank you to everybody that's here today. As Mike mentioned, my name is Michael Long, Director of Railroad Operations and Outreach with the FRA. And I would like to really welcome all of you to our Southeast Florida Lunch and Learn service. Our goal, and the goal of these webinars, this series, is to raise awareness on the dangers of trespassing, to seek out low-cost solutions to local trespassing issues, and to discuss actionable items for technological improvement at grade crossings. Because there's a very simple fact out there. Trespassing is the leading cause of all rail-related deaths. I think everyone here knows that, and that's something we have to work with and deal with. So we're going to talk some kind of grim statistics today, but all are worth repeating. Just last year, more than 681 people were killed because of trespassing on railroad property. Now, this includes those who committed suicide. So those numbers are roughly 528 people classified as trespassing deaths, and another 153 intentionally took their own lives. But those aren't just numbers. They're someone's son, daughter, brother, sister, mother, father. I know there are family members here today who have lost someone along railroad tracks, and we have to be the tireless warriors to spread the word. But I understand why this problem continues. I mean, let's face it, railroads hold a special place in the imagination of the American public, and that's not a bad thing. But all too often, that fascination can turn fatal. The reality that as a culture and a country, we simply have not yet accepted that trains and railroad operations are dangerous. And that's why we're here today. What we do every day is so important. It's why our ambitious goal is to reduce the number of fatalities due to trespassing and suicides by 50% during the next 10 years. Over the last few decades, we've seen the number of fatalities at railroads crossing decrease. However, it has remained relatively unchanged for the last 10 years, and we don't want to see the same with the trespassing. We all know the definition of insanity: doing the same things and expecting a different result. We need to come up with performing new operations, working together differently to meet this 50% reduction. Today's an opportunity for all of us involved in railroading who are dedicated to the cause of safety to redouble our efforts and look for new partnerships and new opportunities to achieve this important life-saving goal. I encourage everyone on here to reach out to FRA and the railroad partners. We'd like to plan our next webinar based on your input. And again, I want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. And at this point, I turn it back to Michael.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Long. As Mr. Long mentioned, folks, we cannot do this alone. The FRA needs your help. The railroads need your help. Railroad trespassing, it's a community issue. For years prior to me joining the Federal Railroad Administration, I always thought it was the railroad's fault, but it's not. It's everybody's issue. And as Mike said, we have to do something different. So today is one of those things that we're involving everybody. We're involving the community, we're involving the railroads, we're involving all our safety partners to see if we can start driving these numbers down. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. James Payne. Mr. James Payne is the staff director for the Grade Crossing and Trespass Outreach Division. Mr. Payne spent 10 years in the United States Marine Corps prior to joining the FRA. He also oversaw the Automated Track Inspection Program from 2004 on for 8 years. Mr. Payne joined FRA in 2012 as the program manager of that ATIP program. In 2019, he joined the Grade Crossing Division as our staff director and has been making wonderful strides since. Mr. Payne?
All right, thanks, Mike. Next slide, please. So one of the main things that this division oversees, just within the title Grade Crossing and Trespass Outreach, one of our guiding documents is a national trespass strategy report that we do to Congress. In 2018, Congress came to us and asked us to take some action, kind of do some studying, and just kind of look at the data and come up with a national strategy that we could develop and deploy throughout the country. And believe it or not, one of these seminars that we're on today and the ones we're going to do in the future are actually part of that national strategy. We sat down and we decided, as Mike G had said, we need to partner with the local communities, with the local public authorities, with the local sheriffs, with the local railroads. It's going to take a group effort to get this taken care of, because for so long, we've all heard it, it's not our problem, or it's the FRA doesn't have any rules, or the local authority has no authority, etc. And so I think it's time that those discussions kind of come to an end, and we need to come together. And so within that national strategy, we broke it down into 4 main categories, as you can see on the slide. The first one was obviously the data gathering and analysis. We wanted to, what does the statistics, what does the data show? Where are the common problems? Are there common problems even between the communities? So we were able to determine that. We've defined some what we call hotspots, or the highest counties in the country that have the worst fatalities and injuries. And to no surprise, some of them were exactly where you think they would be: the Chicagos, the Los Angeleses, the Southern Floridas, Houston, Texas, for another example. And so this actually allowed us to go back to Congress and say, hey, look, we have some hot spot areas that we know we can try to make an impact immediately, instead of trying to wander around the country figuring out where could we make an impact. We knew that. And then from there, what we did is these site visits. We actually went out with our inspectors, with headquarters staff. We've gone out and looked. We've looked at grade crossings. We've looked at trespassing areas, and we've tried to come up with, okay, what is happening in these locations? And then as we were there, number 3 kind of solved itself in the aspect of what was the number 3 to be, and that was funding. When we started talking to these communities and these law enforcement agencies and even the railroads themselves, there's no funding dedicated to any of this. The budgets are usually stretched pretty thin. There's nothing allocated for fencing or upgrading grade crossings that potentially aren't for a quiet zone or something like that. And so we wanted to really make funding part of this. And through our division, the Office of Safety, Mr. Long is my supervisor in the Office of Safety. We've actually come up with some mechanisms to fund some of this stuff, and you're going to hear about it today. And I'm really excited about that because we're talking about funding for the first time ever for a government agency that we know of to do some of this stuff. So it's going to be pretty exciting. I hope that if you come away with anything, the funding will be available for you to start applying for it, which is super exciting. And then the last part, as Mike said, we're not going to leave you. We're not coming in to point things out and then we're going to walk away. We want to partner with the stakeholders, those local communities, to the point that I have 20 plus inspectors that work for me throughout the country for the Grade Crossing and Trespass Outreach Division. And what we're going to do is we're going to have those inspectors in those areas plugged in with people that receive these grants monies to come alongside you to answer your questions, to make sure you're spending the money the way it was supposed to be, etc. And so we really mean it. You know, we've all heard the joke, hey, I'm with the government and I'm here to help. Well, for once, this division actually means it. We're trying to come in, we're going to try and partner with you, and we're going to try and see if we can come up with some solutions. Next slide, please. So the one thing, you know, as we were reiterating is that partnership. We really want to get in and make sure that you understand that you're not alone in this. You know, we're trying to develop and share this data that we're collecting. We talked about data was the number 1 thing. We want to get in there and we want to spend our money where we think or know we'll get the highest return on investment, right? That's what every company wants. That's what every business in the United States goes for. And so we want to do the same thing. So there is some caveats within the grants that, hey, look, if you're in the top 10 counties, you may get a higher consideration, things like that. If you have better justification, we want to hear it, etc. But then we want to come in and we also want to collaborate with some other government agencies, such as the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, because we are finding, you know, with these homeless encampments that are coming up, a lot of these people have substance abuses. We've also learned that some of these substance abuse facilities, they're along the track. The individuals leave the facility in the morning, make a left-hand turn, walk behind the building, and go straight back onto the track. And so we want to try to partner up with them as well, bring them on board, make them, hopefully have them understand what the problem is and see if they can help us as well. And really see if we can start to target that substance abuse and mental health portion of this. And I think that's going to be a big key part to this as well. And so as you can see, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but the FRA did grant 4 grants in 2019 and 2020 for trespass suicide, which was also another first time that that's ever happened. So next slide, please. So the first one we'll talk about here is these trespassing enforcement grants. Last year, we went out with roughly 520K. We issued 11 grants, as you can see on the screen here. With those 11 locations that we went out to, it was amazing. So you're talking about when we see the 225 reporting that comes into FRA, you know, we're talking maybe, you know, 700 to 1,000 reports a year total for the entire industry. And as you can see on this list, one city had 876 interactions on their own. So it kind of goes to show that the railroad is only reporting what they're required to, which that's the rule, but they're also only seeing a fraction of what's going on out there, and the individuals that are getting struck or hit either through trespassing or grade crossing incidents is actually minimum, and it's the smaller portion of a greater issue. And so you're talking just, I think Mike Gersevich can correct me, the grants that we issued, they ran out of money within 8 months. We issued them for 12 months. They were being so effective that they all ran out of money. And as you can see, they had 3,000 total contacts in those 8 months, just at those 11 locations. And to us, that was amazing. And over here on the left side of the screen, you can see we actually have 3 incidences where we know for a fact that this money saved a life. The first one being Fitchburg, Massachusetts. The subject was passed out between the rails. The police officers came up, found him on the rails, and was able to get him off. Greensboro, North Carolina, discovered a subject attempted to commit suicide by train. So they were able to stop that individual, talk to them, get them away from the tracks. And then in Hollywood, Florida, another intoxicated person was actually passed out between the rails, and those law enforcement officers were able to pull them off. So if you really think about it, just those 3, the United States government values a single life, I think it's up to $9.3 million. So you're talking just within these 3 that were found, we were able to save, roughly $27 million worth of value in a human life, which I think we all know is more than that for this little investment, this little return. We were so successful in briefing this up to Congress through our National Trespassing Strategy that the Christie grant that's getting ready to come out will now have $2.3 million this year, which is amazing considering last year was only $528K. And there's other funding opportunities that will be mentioned later on within the Christie grant. But we're really proud of this one. We're really happy. And I encourage all the public authorities that feel that they want to get in and have their local law enforcement help out more. This is the way to go. Next slide. Okay. With that, I appreciate everybody's time. I will turn this back over to Michael Gersevich. And once again, thank you everybody so much for being here. We really appreciate it. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything from the FRA.
Thank you, James. And I'd like to reiterate, as James mentioned, the Railroad Trespassing Enforcement Program, along with the Suicide Prevention Program, started through a conversation that we're having today. In 2012, FRA hosted right-of-way workshops where we brought together subject matter experts, community members, law enforcement, school teachers, homeowners associations, anybody that wanted to listen and provide input, lay members of the public. And coming out of those types of summits that we had, we received several passbacks that said, hey, this would help law enforcement. Hey, we have a suicide prevention program, but we never did it towards rail. We need some funds to implement it on a railroad. So FRA was able to take this information back to Congress, who provides us our funding, and we did start out with a program. The first year in the Federal Railroad Administration's Railroad Enforcement Program, we started out with $198,000 through our R&D department. That $198,000 has grown in 3 years to $2.3 million. With that being said, the first year we had over, I think it was $2 or $3 million in requests asking us for funding. So it's these types of summits or webinars are very beneficial. So I encourage you over and over to please chime in and put anything that you feel is beneficial in the chat. Now I'm going to, and I would like to also call out that I believe it was 4 agencies in Florida received funding from the FRA through the Railroad Trespassing Grant, and 1 agency received funding for the Suicide Prevention Grant. So FRA does see Florida as a hotspot based on the data. We are here trying to help, and hats off to the agencies that did receive our funding in Florida. They really did went above and beyond. When we look at the numbers across the country, Florida's contacts were usually in the top 5 compared to other locations. So hats off to the law enforcement agencies in Florida for really, really putting this money to great use. So let's talk about some trends that are going on in Southeast Florida. FRA has done several studies with Palm Beach and others. So we have gone to Florida. We have tested some of our low-cost solutions that you'll hear about shortly in your own backyard. Can you go to the next slide? What makes us, go to places? We look at the national trends. We look at what's going on. As Mr. Payne mentioned, the railroads are required under federal law to report casualty information to the Federal Railroad Administration. FRA takes that casualty information and we produce data reports to see, can we find any hotspots? Can we make any trends? You'll see from this slide, grade crossing. This data here that we have developed ended in 2020. We did full year data, but bottom line is Florida's 3 for grade crossing. Suicides, trespassing and suicide fatalities, you were 2nd in the country. So I don't want to say you have a problem, but frankly, these are your neighbors, your sisters, your brothers, your community members that are being struck by a train. So we really want to drive home. We need your help to lower these numbers. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the state of Florida, and then I'm going to talk about 3 counties in specific. The state of Florida, as you heard me mention, for trespassing casualties, you had 239 fatalities from 2016 to 2020. In the Federal Railroad Administration, railroads are allowed to amend the data or provide the data for so many years based on federal regulations. So I ran these numbers yesterday, and you had 239 fatalities. 239 of your citizens of Florida were struck and killed by a train. As you heard earlier, train's an attractive nuisance. Everybody likes it. Kids love it. Recreational folks, why not? I mean, we go all over the country. It's the perfect area for recreation because it's a long straight right away. Nobody bothers me. So we're trying to drive home that these places are an attractive nuisance, but it's against the law and illegal. Overall, between trespassing and suicide, you had 319 fatalities. Palm Beach, you're 4th in the nation for the most trespassing fatalities. Broward County, you were 7th in the nation for the most trespassing fatalities. Next slide. So I looked at some of the actions. What are folks in Florida doing? See, can we figure out? Most of them, yep, they're walking. Of course, they were struck by a train or on-track equipment, but most of them were walking. We have a lot of people that were laying or standing, sitting. Is there any age group that sticks out? As you can see, it's kind of all over the place from basically 30 up to 59. The days, the months, which month is better, which month is bad? In some sense, it's almost a straight line. We did see a dip in the, a raise in the time of day from to 8 p.m. I think, in all honesty, the sun goes down in Florida. It's not 100 degrees at night, so everybody goes out for a beautiful walk in the evening. When we look at the days of week, they're kind of all over, but Tuesday, it's kind of ahead of the game. And anybody can access this data through our grade crossing and trespassing dashboard that's located at fra.dot.gov. Next slide, please. So let's look at the counties. Palm Beach County, as I said, you're 4th in the nation. I also want to point out Palm Beach County was an excellent partner with the Federal Railroad Administration on one of our law enforcement grants. So I want to thank them for participating in that grant. But Palm Beach County led it with 75 fatalities over the 5 years that we looked at. 75 folks in Palm Beach County lost their lives, 34 were injured. Next slide, please. Looking at the trends, again, walking along the railroad tracks was the biggest thing to jump out. You can also notice, again, the month kind of upticked in July. And of course, the time was more in the morning here for Palm Beach County. Now, keep in mind, when I developed these, we only looked at trespassing casualties. We did not put in near miss or any type of like that. It was only trespasser casualty information. Next slide, please. Broward County, we kind of looked at the numbers. Broward, you're 7th in the nation for the most trespassing fatalities. I also want to point out Broward County was an excellent partner with the Federal Railroad Administration, excuse me, and they did receive a railroad trespassing enforcement grant. Excellent partners, Broward and Palm Beach County, working with the FRA. They went above and beyond and have provided us some excellent data that we're able to analyze. Broward County, you had 52 trespassing fatalities. When you had suicides in there, you had 66 overall. Again, these numbers are high, very high, and the two counties that we looked at currently, when you're 4th and 7th in the country, we really need to do something together to drive these numbers down. Next slide, please. When we looked at Broward County, looked at what was going on in Broward County, Mondays kind of stuck out to us. Of course, walking along the railroad track. Again, your months were peaks and valleys. Same with your time of day. Of course, it did go up a little bit in the evening hours. And there's really no rhyme or reason. FRA, the data we collect, we collect this data, but we can't really get into the minds of what these folks were doing prior to trespassing, whether they were conducting recreational activities or those types of things. That's why working with our law enforcement partners in this year's upcoming grant award, we will be collecting information on what that living person was doing, whether they were exercising, hunting, fishing, jogging, or just taking a shortcut. So hopefully FRA will have better information to work with our partners to combat this issue. Next slide, please. Miami-Dade, we looked at Miami-Dade's numbers. Miami-Dade did not come in the top 10 of our numbers when we're looking at trespassing. Overall, Miami-Dade had 23 fatalities, 18 injuries over the time period that we looked at. Still very high, and I will add that the 2020 numbers dipped for everybody across the country for obvious reasons with the national pandemic, but we still did see folks that were casualties for trespassing on railroad property during the 2020 timeframe. Next slide, please. Looking at the data, what was going on in Miami-Dade County. Again, Tuesdays kind of jumped out off the record. You can kind of see that. Why? We really don't know. Again, you had some peaks in July, November, and December. I can only say climate, maybe. Again, you had peaks in the time of day, early morning, late evening. I would attribute that to most likely the weather environment. But with that being said, it's really hard to unknow. Next slide, please. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Francesco Bonini. He joined the FRA in 2017. He currently serves as our program manager for the Grade Crossing and Trespass Research Program Office. Francesco is basically responsible for all our grade crossing and trespass research at the Federal Railroad Administration. He previously worked 4 years for the Illinois Department of Transportation on the Chicago to St. Louis high-speed rail project. He holds a Bachelor and a Master's of Science degree in Civil Engineering from both the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Francesco, I'd like to turn it over to you and to your research team.
Hey, thank you, Mike, for the introduction. So good afternoon, and again, welcome on behalf of FRA to everybody to this first series of summits on trespassing. And as my colleagues mentioned before, trespassing is an issue, and the data that you've been seeing, I can tell you, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And the data that we are collecting, and I'm going to briefly talk about it, is showing that there's a huge number of people that actually accessed the railroad illegally. So just to give you an introduction, so as Mike said, I run the Grade Crossing and Trespass Research Program for the FRA, and our mission is to listen to you, to the needs that the community have, the stakeholders have, the railroads have, and to develop solutions that could be then in turn used and adopted immediately. And you will hear from my colleagues in subsequent slides about ways to fund these solutions. What I wanted to say is, as Mr. Payne said, and Mr. Wiskevich said, there's been a collection of what 3,000 encounters through law enforcement activity in terms of trespassing, but that doesn't include the full picture. I mean, I got a project and it's in the works. It's a work in progress, but we have actually tested in 4 locations at 4 crossings, and we detected something like 38,000 trespass events at those 4 locations, and the numbers are unbelievably high. So that is telling us that trespassing is indeed a problem, and it needs to we need to get down to a solution. So with that introduction, I would like to go to the next slide, please. And I would like to introduce my counterpart at Volpi, Mr. Marco da Silva, who is a senior engineer at the Volpi Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And his work portfolio includes the management of the grade crossing and trespass research that I'm responsible for. Mr. Da Silva, who has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Boston University and a master's of science degree in the transportation engineering from Northeastern. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marco, who's going to give us a few highlights of the research that we're doing. Marco, over to you. Marco, you there? You have to unmute yourself.
I think Marco might be having some technical issues. I understand there's a bad rainstorm going through the area where some of our folks are at. Monica would get back in. She lost the internet in her entire neighborhood. But Marco, as Francesco mentioned, is a senior engineer at U.S. Department of Transportation's Volpi Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Marco manages the Highway Rail Grade Crossing and Trespass Research Program in support of the Federal Railroad Administration. He holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from BU and a master's of science degree in transportation from Northeastern University. Next slide, please. I'll chime in until Marco joins us.
Can you hear me now, Mike?
Yep, we can.
All right, I'm sorry about that. I don't know exactly what happened, but it seems that it's working now. All right, sorry about that, everyone. So thank you, Mike and Francesco, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to provide an overview of the FRA's Community Trespassing Prevention Guide, which was released about 10 years ago. For rail trespass prevention programs to be effective, the underlying causes of trespassing, as well as the specific target audience for problem-solving efforts must be determined. To assist in addressing these issues, the Community Analysis, Response, and Evaluation Problem-Solving Model, or CARE for short, was developed. This model provides a step-by-step method of identifying, analyzing, and effectively addressing trespass issues in the community. At the same time of the guide's release, we implemented it in the research study on the ground in the city of West Palm Beach in Florida, and involved local government, state DOT, and the commuter and freight railroads operating in the city, among other stakeholders. I will mention elements of this implementation and demonstration during that study as we go through the guide in this presentation. As shown in this slide, the guide is broken into 4 major steps, which we label CARE. It stands for Community Analysis, Response, and Evaluation. And a summary of each is shown in this table, but I will discuss them in more detail in the following slides. Next slide, please. So the stated goal of the guide is to create safer communities by fostering the development of long-term trespass prevention strategies through collaborative community problem-solving partnerships. So the key here is to create and leverage collaborative partnerships between all potential stakeholders, not just the railroad or local government, but include all potential stakeholders from across the spectrum. So local community organizations, businesses, law enforcement, education, and safety partners, et cetera. The ultimate objective of the guide is to reduce the number of trespass and related injuries and deaths nationwide. Next slide, please. The guide incorporates a problem-solving model designed to provide a step-by-step approach for dealing with trespassing issues in the community. Development of this guide and its supporting materials is based on actual community problem-solving projects. So things that were done on the ground that we've learned from through the years. So it includes solving existing trespass issues as well as potential issues that may be realized with rezoning or planned construction activity. So disseminating good practices developed through previous and current community-based trespass prevention projects helps everyone. Next slide, please. So I'll go through the 4 steps in the next few slides. The first step in the CARE model is community. Here we try to identify both what the trespassing problem is and, importantly, identify potential community stakeholders who can assist in the problem-solving efforts. First, we try to develop a general statement to describe the problem. So here's one example in the slide. Children are crossing the railroad tracks where 8th Street dead ends at the tracks. So that's an example of a problem. Based on what you already know about the problem, you can then identify resources in the community that may be able to assist in the problem-solving process. Examples are parents, neighborhood groups, community organizations, law enforcement, railroad safety representatives, and so on. Once those are identified, you proceed then to organize a problem-solving meeting to discuss the issue and develop an action plan for the community. Now, this can be done specific to each location or more generally across several areas or along a corridor. The picture on the top right is of a stakeholder meeting held during the West Palm Beach CARE model implementation we did from 2010 to 2012. Representatives from the railroads, commuter and freight railroads, local, county, and state government, including law enforcement, school districts, and planning departments, and neighborhood groups were all part of this group. The picture on the bottom is of representatives of this group performing site visits to trespass areas of concern. And I believe some of our friends from that group are present today at this call. Next slide, please. The second step is analysis. As its name notes, the step focuses on collecting more detailed information about the trespassing problem and determine its underlying causes through analysis of the data. Trespass data can come from FRA reported incidents, law enforcement reports, internal railroad trespass reports, and locomotive video data if available, trespass site surveys, and other sources. The data should not just be about casualty resulting incidents, which could be few, but also include near miss reports and other trespass reports and observations. For our West Palm Beach study, we used FRA reported data, internal reports from all 4 railroads that operated in the area, analysis of locomotive video data from the commuter railroad, and data collected from stationary cameras strategically placed at several known trespass locations. The graphic in this slide presents the results of a location-based trespass risk analysis through the 7-mile corridor through the city of West Palm Beach on the commuter rail line. The analysis revealed the areas of highest risk as shown in red on this track chart. Next slide, please. The objective is to use the data to answer who, what, when, where, why, and how in as much detail as possible. The pictures to the right show examples of trespassing at 2 different locations in our study area. The top one from locomotive video and the bottom one from strategically placed cameras. From this, we can get a better general picture of the factors involved in trespassing at a location. Who is generally doing it, what they're doing, are they crossing the tracks or are they walking along the right of way? How frequent is this happening daily and when? So what time of day? And as Mike gave you some overview of that data in previous slides. And also, very important, how they're entering and exiting the right of way. So how are they accessing the right of way? Next slide, please. So knowing these details will help determine the cause or causes of trespassing at each location. The stakeholder group should then develop a statement describing the underlying causes and scale of the problem. So a small scale problem may only need 1 or 2 stakeholders to tackle it, while a large scale problem may need all hands on deck across many organizations. At this point, additional stakeholders or other community resources that may be needed to help solve this problem may also be identified and brought into the group at this point. At the end of this step, the group should be able to devise effective countermeasures or other interventions to address the problem. The group should also identify effectiveness measures, meaning what is their goal? Is it to eliminate the trespass problem? Is it to reduce it by some percentage? Is it to increase public awareness overall? So the group should reach a consensus on what success looks like so they can evaluate it later on. Next slide, please. The third step in this model is response, and it's really to identify and implement the most effective and feasible response or responses that will help solve the underlying cause of trespassing. These can be education, engineering, enforcement, a combination of the three, and/or other strategies. The picture to the right shows the countermeasure implementation plan for engineering treatments at one of the trespass locations in our West Palm Beach study. Countermeasures for this location included additional no trespassing signage, reinforced fencing at a strategic location midway through the curve, as well as outreach and education initiatives aimed at the nearby elementary school, and increased law enforcement patrols both on the school side and behind the housing complex on the other side of the tracks. Next slide, please. The last step is evaluation of the process. So were the correct stakeholders and resources identified? Did we identify the correct underlying causes? Was the plan implemented as designed, and why or why not? So potential major challenges are, so lack of a local champion to keep the momentum going. That's a very big issue, could be a very big issue. Lack of funding or other resources, obviously another big issue. Stakeholder commitment, and also turnover, especially within government stakeholders if longer term program is instituted. And what happened to the trespass problem? Did it go away or reduce by some level or remain ineffective? Did it move down to another location? Finally, will this project require a long-term commitment in monitoring? Who will need to be involved? So what resources will be needed? What could happen if the responses are left in place? What could happen if they're taken away? And these are all questions that should be addressed in the evaluation step. Next slide, please. So in summary, the guide details an approach for collaboration between different stakeholders and provides a step-by-step approach for dealing with trespassing issues in communities. The guide also has several appendices, including sample forms and assessment and survey guides. As I mentioned, we implemented and evaluated the guide in a research study in West Palm Beach, Florida. Links to the guide, as well as the West Palm Beach implementation report and a journal article with more information are listed in this slide. And I believe the slides will be shared with the group at some point. So you'll have access to all these links. Next slide, please. Next, I'm going to switch gears and highlight a few countermeasures for rail trespass prevention. I'll touch on a few examples on detection and warning technologies, anti-trespass treatments, and education and enforcement activities. For education, I would like to mention that this week is Rail Safety Week. This annual week-long event is a collaborative effort among rail safety partners across the US. Some of the folks and organizations present today are participating in rail safety activities throughout the week in South Florida. So thank you for that. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about detection and warning for trespassing. Here are two examples. These systems can either be fixed or mobile. Fixed systems rely on ground-based cameras and/or sensors that are used to detect a potential trespass event. An example of such a system demonstrated by the FRA over the past several years is shown in the two pictures above. This system consisted of pan-tilt-zoom cameras, or PTZ cameras, and used video motion detection. When tripped, live video of the location was fed into the local police department's dispatch center, at which point a dispatcher could take control of the camera, They could pan, tilt, and zoom, and verify if it was a trespasser, and then use a speaker to deliver a warning message. If that trespasser didn't leave the area, then an officer would be dispatched to the location. The picture on the top left is of the screens with the video feed at the police department's dispatch center, and a picture of one of the stationary camera systems is on the top right. A link to the research report is also listed here. Another approach is to use mobile systems. These could be ground-based, where you place them temporarily at a location, but then can move them to other locations, or air-based, as shown at the bottom section of this slide. The example shown here is from an FRA research demonstration using a drone platform to detect trespassers along the right-of-way. For this project, we worked with the police department to get officers trained and licensed by the FAA to operate a drone. There are some limitations to this approach, but benefits include the capability to conduct surveillance in difficult to reach areas and also keep officers out of harm's way. A picture of the drone in flight is shown here, as well as a snapshot of a trespass event captured by the drone. A research report detailing the results of this demonstration is also listed here. Next slide, please. There exists a significant range of physical countermeasures to detect trespassing. A list of several of these is shown on this slide. These are primarily aimed at non-crossing locations, the ones on this slide. They range from low cost, such as warning signs, fencing, of which I've listed 2 references on research and benefits estimates here. Landscaping, which basically tries to do the same as fencing, but can be more aesthetically pleasing to the local community. Removal of obstructions of vegetation, and this can be a good option for locations where trespassers loiter, usually at locations where their activities can't be seen from nearby streets, etc. To higher cost countermeasures such as grade separation, usually combined with fencing and dedicated pedestrian over or underpasses. These are obviously the most expensive solutions and take much longer to implement. Next slide, please. There are also several anti-trespass treatments designed specifically for highway rail grade crossings and rights-of-way adjoining them. As most of you probably know, pedestrian casualties at crossings have been steadily increasing throughout the past decade. The 3 treatments shown here have been researched by the FRA over the past several years. A research study on the top one, on anti-trespass guard panels, showed a reduction of 38% of people accessing the right-of-way from a crossing location. These panels are now being installed in the Chicago area and others. The middle treatment consists of adding a secondary gate to existing pedestrian gates, along with channelization to prevent pedestrians from ducking under or going around a down gate. Research on installations at 3 different crossings pointed to a significant reduction in pedestrian gate violations with the addition of this treatment. The example at the bottom is really aimed at preventing vehicles from driving onto the tracks at crossing locations by extending pavement markings and adding flexible delineators on both sides and in between the tracks. The research results are for vehicles, but we also see a potential positive benefit of extending the pavement markings through the crossing for pedestrians, who in many cases lose the cues of the sidewalk while traversing a crossing. You can see links of all 3 of those results in this slide. Next slide, please. On the enforcement side, 2 FRA research results are offered in this slide. As Mr. Payne mentioned earlier, FRA awarded 11 grants to law enforcement agencies in 2019 with great results. This was a direct result of an FRA law enforcement targeted trespassing pilot program conducted in 2018 that stemmed, as Mike Kriskevich mentioned, from a research needs workshop idea several years earlier. And in this pilot program in 2018, 4 communities participated. The results of that pilot study are in the bottom link of this page. Later in this session, you'll hear more information on the 2021 Law Enforcement Grant Program, which is the next iteration of this very successful initial pilot program. Next slide, please. So for further research, information, and to view and download published FRA research reports, you can visit the FRA Research Repository. The FRA has also recently published a national strategy for trespass prevention on railroad property, previously mentioned by Mr. Payne and linked here. One other resource where to find published FRA research on this topic is the National Transportation Library's Repository and Open Science Access Portal, otherwise known as ROSA-P, where you can search for grade crossing and trespass-related publications. Finally, one other resource that will hopefully be coming online very soon is a Trespass and Suicide Prevention Countermeasures Toolkit, which actually includes a lot of the countermeasures I briefly mentioned in the previous slides. And my colleague, Dr. Gabri, will discuss in the next presentation. So thank you, and I turn it back to Francesco.
Okay, thank you, Marco. The next speaker is going to be Dr. Scott Gabri. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So Dr. Gabri joined Volpe in 2009, and he works closely with Dr. Shay LeBlue, who is my counterpart in the Office of Research and Development on Grade Crossing and Trespass from the human factors perspective. So as I said, Dr. Gabri is the manager of the research program for grade crossing and trespass prevention at the Volpe Center Human Factors Division. Trespass prevention program seeks to better understand trespass and suicide incidents on the U.S. railroad system and what rail carriers may be able to do in coordination with other groups to help reduce the frequency and impact of these events. Dr. Gabri has a team at Volpe that is currently working with several rail carriers from around the country to try to improve our understanding of rail suicide. So with that, I'm going to be turning it over to Dr. Gabri, and we can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. I appreciate that. So I'm going to be kind of pivoting from some of what Marco talked about, which is focusing on the specific work that's being done, and transition over to some work that we are working on. Myself and my team at the Volpe Center working on with Dr. Shay LeBlue and some folks at the FRA to develop a toolkit where the information and the research that's being done can get out to the people who might want to make use of that information. On the slide you see now is where we were inspired for this effort. And this is an effort known as RESTRAIL, which was implemented by the European Union from 2010 to 2014, where an effort was funded to implement and study a lot of different trespass and suicide prevention strategies. And that all culminated in 2014 in the development of this toolbox, which is a place where people could go understand kind of the details of what had been done through this project and other ways to address trespass and suicide prevention. We found ourselves here in the US leaning on this and sending links to other people, but realized over time that the European focus of this sometimes made it challenging for US groups to really see how the work that was being done there transitioned here. So we realized this is an opportunity, working with the FRA, to find a way to do something similar but more tailored for a US audience. If you go to the next slide, please. This is in draft form and it's not published yet, but we are hoping that it will be in not too long. So this is kind of a draft beta version of this, but this will be a US-based trespass and suicide prevention toolkit, a way for people interested in doing something about trespass and suicide problems to come here, use this as a resource to figure out what they might be able to do, how they might be able to effectively implement the different strategies that might fit their need, and figure out exactly with whom they might partner to do that. So I'll walk through over the next couple slides a little bit more about what this looks like, how it's organized. So maybe we can go to the next slide, please. So when we looked at the RESTRAIL toolkit toolbox, we said, what do we want to keep and what do we want to kind of change and improve upon? The number one thing that we wanted to change was to make sure that we were transitioning this so it was designed for a US audience. A lot of the research that was done in the European version obviously was European. We wanted to focus this on US-based research that was more relevant to culture here in the US, to the way that the rail system operates in the US, to the communities through which the rail system is traveling. So it's much more US focused. We'll still include international research in this, but maybe not quite as focused as it was in the European version. We wanted to keep that this was filterable, searchable, that if you wanted to find a measure but weren't really sure what you were looking for, you could use filters to get down and understand the types of things that might work for you. We wanted to make sure that this information was summarized. We weren't presenting too much information. It's presented in a succinct way that was easily digestible. But to go to the next bullet, but also if you do want to dig in a little bit deeper, if you want to read the technical reports or the details, that we provide kind of a way for you to get to the specific information that drove the information that's on that website. And lastly, that it's regularly updated. The REST-Rail toolkit is still being updated, but after the 2014 finish of that group, the updates were a little bit less frequent, and I think we're hoping we can make sure that the most up-to-date information is always on here so it can be made, it can be of use. Next slide, please. So when I talked about that this toolkit is filterable, I wanted to give an idea of what these filters are. As I mentioned, this is just kind of an initial version. We've been through a lot of different types of filters that we thought might be helpful, but to give a little idea of what this will look like, I think when it eventually launches, we have kind of 4 key places on which you can filter to find what you're looking for. The first is the type of incident. Is the problem that you're trying to address largely suicide? Is it largely trespass? Is it a combination of both? We know that in different parts of the country, that problem looks very different. So if your problem is suicide, you can check that box and find things that will address it. Of course, there's a lot of measures that address both. You know, if you put up a fence, it might be effective for both of these. So that type of a measure would come up for both of them. But if you're looking to kind of eliminate things that are only trespass or only suicide, you can use that. The next is about the location. When we were pulling these measures together, we found that some are very station-based. It's things that would be implemented at a station, and some are things that would really only be implemented out on the right of way. And then there's other ones, maybe messaging campaigns or something that are kind of independent of that. But if you know your specific problem is really at stations, or you're a freight railroad and it's out on the right of way, you can make sure to tailor your search to only hit those types of measures. The next, which is implementation strategy, is maybe more common to what rail safety folks think of. Thank you. Education, enforcement, engineering. Here, education being outreach and messaging, enforcement being developing policy and enforcing that policy, engineering being technical and physical ways to deter. And then we added a fourth, which is data, just trying to, maybe there's somebody that doesn't fully understand where and why their problem is happening. We're providing some resources to say, maybe this is how you can make use of the data that you're collecting, or maybe collect these types of data to help inform what you might do. And last is something that kind of fell out of as we were pulling these measures together. Logical groups started to form. I think we have about 50 or so, probably a little bit less than that, different measures, and they would fall into these categories that made logical sense. Assessing risk, maybe collaborating and educating, public communication, physical barriers, detection and lighting, various types of things that kind of fall into similar buckets. So if you know the rough idea of the type of thing you're looking to do, you can use that to just kind of get down to this group and understand a little bit more about what you might do. So next slide, please. So that's just a discussion about how you might find the individual measures that you're looking for. Once you find a measure, we were trying to figure out the best way to present the information that someone might want. And the way we've chosen to do this to start is that the information is separated within 7 different tabs for each measure. You've got a description, notable practices, advantages, drawbacks, images, references, and related measures. And you can see in the image there, it's different tabs that you can kind of click to look through that. Up at the top of, right above where those tabs are, you can see where it says anti-trespass panels, which will be the example that I'll use for this. The title is there. Right below it, it says material installed alongside and across the tracks to make footing unreliable in order to deter entry to the right of way. Kind of a quick definition so that you can see it at a glance. the little minus sign after that, you can collapse the information. So you can expand and collapse, see different measures next to one another, try to make it a little bit more manageable to see it all on the page. For the next couple slides, I'm just going to walk through each of these tabs to share kind of how we've organized the information here. So the next slide, please. So the first tab is a description. For most of these, this is just a high-level review of what this is. What is an anti-trespass panel? Marco talked about the study that he and Tashi did down in Arkansas briefly about using the anti-trespass panels, which we'll see in here, but it'll give an idea of what that means. What is an anti-trespass panel? When might you use it? Is there any studies that show that this actually works? Is there empirical evidence that this works? Those types of things will all go into the description so that you can get kind of a high level idea of when you might use this, who's used it in the past, and did it work or not. Next slide. The next slide is notable practices, which what we tried to do here is to take any sort of paper that was written about these topics, distill down the take-home points where if you decide you're going to try to implement anti-trespass panels, what do we want people to know? So you know, you see things here like when you're determining the width of the panel, consider that people might try to jump over this. So don't make it so that it's just a stride length, make it a little bit longer than that. Other things like ensuring that there's an escape route for train passengers or for emergency evacuations, that the people aren't going to have to scramble over the top of this. Figuring out who's responsible for maintaining a panel. So if dirt or debris or snow falls into this and makes them ineffective because the snow builds up, do you have someone who is going to go out and maintain this? Those types of things that some people might think about, but it's kind of lessons learned from others in the past that we're trying to share ahead of time to ease implementation if somebody decides that this works for them. Next slide, please. The next one here is advantages, which is a discussion of things that make this measure good. So if you have the right situation, it seems like this is a good fit. Things like they're simple to install, that they can be cut to fit around existing infrastructure. You don't have to remove infrastructure to do anything like it. The fact that it can be installed in between the gauge and outside. Different things that might make this an attractive measure for someone where this is something they're considering. And then the flip side of that is in drawbacks, which is the next slide, please. And that talks about things that might make this implementation a little more challenging. So, you know, the things like difficulty accessing this for maintenance or law enforcement. And then the idea of things like snow building up. So, you know, the Tashi and Marco's study was down in Arkansas, I believe, where there's not a lot of snow, but in Michigan, you probably need someone to readily be maintaining this so that the snow doesn't build up and completely eliminate the effectiveness of this measure. So different things that might be a drawback depending on your circumstances. Next slide, please. The next is images, which kind of gives an idea of what this looks like. Not every one of these are going to be have images because an image might not be necessary, but for something like anti-trespass panels where the name alone doesn't really convey exactly what it is, sometimes it's nice to have an image so you can show it to the people who are making the decision for whether they'll move forward with something like this or not. I apologize if there's duplicates of the images. That's an IT glitch we are currently working through, but just a way to show what these look like. Next slide, please. The next is references, which I talked about before, but you might have seen in some of the prior examples, there would be a number in brackets, and those correspond to the numbers on this. So if you look at something and see that there's a recommendation or a notable practice, it'll have a little bracketed number next to it. You can come here, click on that link to go to Tashi and Marco's study that they did down in Arkansas, and learn a little bit more. I think this is our way of saying we want to present things succinctly, but we also want to provide as much context as possible for people who want it. So you can get into that and get into the details if you choose to. And down at the bottom, we'll often have additional resources, which might be whether it's a news story or a website or something that might be helpful to understand a little bit more about this measure, but isn't really something that we're citing or is in there, but something that might be additionally helpful will be included. And then lastly, if you could go to the next slide, please. Related measures are things that are maybe if you're considering anti-trespass panels, it's something that might be a similar type of approach. Or also, I don't think I mentioned this, but one of the notable practices is that you want to pair anti-trespass panels with channelization, because if you don't have fencing on either side, someone can just walk around the panels and it makes them useless. So we have links to right-of-way fencing and fencing between tracks and fencing at barriers at bridges and different things that somebody might want to pair with that type of a measure were they to choose to do this. So if you could go to the next slide, please. That kind of summarizes the information that would be there. It's a lot of information, so you may be asking, who is this for? And we tried to make the audience for this as broad as possible. I think we did it initially with some FRA field staff in mind, people from the FRA that understand the rail system well. They understand how the FRA approaches these problems. This might be a way to quickly share with a rail carrier or a community or someone who they might be talking with what's available, what they might do. When somebody says, well, what does an anti-trespass panel look like? You might have something on you where you can show them on the toolkit exactly what it looks like. We see that as very helpful, but we also see it's helpful for railroad employees, community members, researchers, suicide prevention groups. I feel like we've talked in my work with suicide prevention groups often who don't quite know how to get started because it feels like a very foreign world talking to the railroad sometimes. And we try to provide some things here. We have a section on collaboration between railroads and suicide prevention groups to say, where that common ground may be, how that coordination may happen. So really, we see it as a very broad audience that might find this helpful. And next and last slide, please. So lastly, where this all stands. So as I said, this is not quite live, but we are working our way towards having an initial version of this. We just finished a round of very early kind of beta testing, trying to make sure we work out the kinks before things go live. We're finalizing all the content and the measures and finalizing a user guide so that when this goes out, people will really understand how to use it. So we're in the process now of kind of taking that information, working with the FRA and their IT staff to kind of get as much of that tweaked before it goes live as we can, which is what we're working on now. And then ideally, in the not too distant future, the website will go live. And for us, that's really the beginning of this, because once folks like the people on this call start using this and realizing what's working and what's not, we really welcome feedback to that, because the goal of this is to make something that helps people who want to improve safety to find what will help them do that most effectively. And if the website's not quite hitting that goal, our goal is to tweak it and make sure that it does. So really hoping that we can hear from you and work with you as this goes public. So that's all I have today. And I think thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Mike, I believe.
Thank you, Dr. Gabri. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Matthew Laura. Mr. Matthew Laura is the Acting Chief of Grants and Program Management Division at FRA. Mr. Laura has worked in federal grants for 16 years. He has spent the past 10 years working with FRA's grant programs in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer and Office of Railroad Policy and Development. Previously, he has worked on federal grants with the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security. Prior to working in grants, he worked as an auditor for the Department of Army. He has an accounting degree from Bloomberg University of Pennsylvania. He resides with his wife and 3 children in Virginia. Mr. Laura.
Thanks, Monica.
You're welcome.
As Monica mentioned, my name is Matthew Laura. So I'm going to go over now some of the funding that we have available to assist in, implementing these trespassing solutions. So next slide, please. As you guys had mentioned earlier in the presentations, we have already done in previous years pilot programs, one that was specific to law enforcement activities and another one that was geared towards suicide prevention. So the law enforcement grants have already actually mostly run their course. They were obligated, and we've actually seen results from those grants. The suicide prevention grants from the pilot program, were selected and are actually just going through the obligation process now. Sometimes that takes several months to get from a selected application to actually being obligated to start your project. So we're just seeing those ones move into the obligation phase now. Those were in the pilot programs. Both of those were posted and announced as standalone NOFOs, what we call our notice of funding opportunities, meaning that they were, the trespassing, the law enforcement trespassing enforcement program was standalone. It was just that pot of money. The suicide prevention grant program was standalone, just that pot of money. As we've seen somewhat success from those pilot programs, we're now going to incorporate those into our larger, what is really FRA's umbrella grant program, which is our most broad, overreaching grant program, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program. This is where we believe in future years, Congress is going to be including most of our trespassing money is in the appropriations that we receive for the CRISI program. So this year you'll see, again, it's our largest dollar value and broadest program. It's this year funded at $362 million. What we're going to talk today about, though, is a few specific set-asides that target trespassing activities. If you're interested in seeing more about the larger CRISI program, there was a webinar yesterday. It was recorded and will be available on our website by the end of next week. We hit on a little bit of the stuff we're going to talk about today as well. But if you're interested in the larger program, go check out that webinar on our website. Today we're going to focus just on these trespassing specific set-asides, which make up a smaller portion of that larger $362 million. Next slide, please. So we'll start with the three set-asides are within the CRISI appropriation, meaning what Congress provided to us this year specific to CRISI. Congress had already set aside $25 million specifically for capital and engineering solutions that target trespassing. So really thinking construction there. We, FRA, added our own funding that was appropriated to us from Congress into the program as well. We added an additional $2 million to, again, keep moving forward with the law enforcement trespassing grant program. And we're adding another $207 million in for the trespassing suicide prevention grant program. And that's carrying forward the activities that were made available in those standalone programs in previous years. So you'll see, for the trespassing enforcement, that is paying for law enforcement activities at trespassing hotspots, and the suicide prevention is implementation or expansion of targeted outreach campaigns. Next slide, please. So first, speaking particularly to the $25 million set aside, because this was appropriated directly from Congress as part of the CRISI program, it contains all of the requirements set forth in the CRISI NOFO. So you'll want to read that NOFO. It is available both on our grants, on our FRA's grants and loans website, as well as grants.gov. And so this 25 million is, again, just for capital and engineering solutions. There is no predetermined minimum or maximum dollar amount, but all the requirements and eligibility from the CRISI program will apply to this $25 million set aside. And sorry, I'm getting notes now that I may have said 207 million for the suicide prevention, 207,000. The amount on the slide was correct, and we'll get to it again here in the next slide. Next slide, please. So for the trespassing law enforcement grants, we're looking at just a hair over $2 million. A couple notes here that you're going to take note of is when we get to the eligibility, there are a couple bullets within the CRISI eligibility that I'll highlight that will be eligible for, or most eligible for the law enforcement. But when you're looking to apply for the law enforcement grants, you should be looking at FR regulated track, hotspots on FR regulated. We're looking to fund hourly wages for law enforcement, and that can be their, their 9-to-5 salary. More often than not, it is actually we're funding overtime so these folks can go above and beyond, and we will fund the overtime for these folks to go out and do trespassing enforcement activities in these hotspots. Here, for these smaller set-asides, we do have a maximum grant award of $120,000, because obviously we're working on a smaller pot of money here. There is no minimum. Big point of emphasis here is on the 25 million, there is a 20% match, which means the local entity has to provide at least 20%. The federal share can only be 80%. When you get into the trespassing enforcement or the suicide prevention, there is no match required. The federal share can be 100% of your project costs. Next slide, please. So suicide prevention, again, clarifying 207,000, not 207 million. Again, here we have a maximum grant award. This time it is 100,000. And again, the federal share can be 100% of the project cost. The 80-20 federal share versus match that applies to the rest of the CRISI program does not apply to law enforcement or suicide prevention. Couple notes there on the side. In this case particularly, that FRA through our grants maintain the right to republish and use information created under this grant to advance railroad safety. Next slide, please. So this is the overarching applicant eligibility for the CRISI program as a whole. Generally speaking, for the law enforcement grants, you're going to be looking at those first three bullets, a state or local government agency that has law enforcement capabilities. So if you are one of those agencies and you cover FRA regulated track in a hotspot, that's who we're looking for to apply for that law enforcement funding. On the suicide prevention, it can be a little broader. Sometimes you can get some research folks in there, or it can be a state agency as well. But this is our again, overarching CRISI eligibility, and this would apply to the 25 million for the construction projects. Next slide, please. So when you guys get in and you're getting ready to put an application in for any one of those three set-asides in the CRISI program, a couple things that we're looking for here is we always evaluate our grant applications on technical merit. So a couple things that we're looking for is, you need to lay out your expected outcomes from your project. Project readiness, specifically on the construction side. Is this something that you're ready to move forward with today? Do you have federal environmental impact? Have you gone through the NEPA process? Do you have the technical capability to carry out this type of project? You need to provide out your project benefits. The trespassing ones may not hit on system performance as much, but certainly safety. Safety is going to be a big one there. So when we get down to the selection criteria, you can see the preference there. On two of the set-asides, there is no federal share required, so we're not going to lean on that, but we are going to look for maximized benefits. And the last bullet, projects that target trespassing with documented incidences. So, when you're writing up your grant applications, the key point here is, make sure you are very clear in what the benefits of your project are going to be for your constituency in your area. What are we buying with our federal dollars if we select your grant application? Next slide, please. Across all federal grant programs right now, the Biden-Harris administration is pushing 5 high-level objectives, and you'll see the first one is safety. Improve safety at highway rail grade crossings and reduces incidents of trespassing. That's what these 3 set-asides are very particularly set forth to do. So that any application under these 3 set-asides should certainly obviously meet the safety criteria. We're also looking for equitable economic strength. I cannot imagine there's much carryover into the climate change, but the administration is promoting resilience and addressing climate change. Probably not much that you can do with these grants in that area, but certainly we're also going to look at racial equality and economic inclusion, as well as just transformation of the nation's, transportation infrastructure. So those are 5 high-level objectives that the administration is pushing us to look at for all grant programs, and certainly several of those apply in the CRISI and particularly the trespassing set-asides. Next slide, please. So, you guys are all here, you're all interested in the trespassing. Several of you want to be involved in the grants. How do I apply for a grant? So first and foremost, you want to go out and find the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, for the FY21 CRISI program. If you simply just Google FRA grants and go to our grants and loans webpage, it's listed under our discretionary grant programs. If you go to grants.gov and search by the CFDA number 20.325, that is the CFDA or assistance listing number for the CRISI program. It'll bring up the opportunity there as well. So you'll want to read the first thing we tell everybody, read the entire NOFO. It lays out all the criteria, all the eligibility, all the required documents. It is the step-by-step process to walk you through how do you apply for a grant under this program. Next slide, please. What's in a NOFO? If you've not applied for federal grants before, it is a fairly standard process across all federal agencies. The pieces of a NOFO are laid out to us, the FRA, in federal guidance, and all other federal agencies should be following the same guidance to CFR 200. So the key parts of a NOFO are obviously the key dates, and I'll point out right now that the due date for all applications under CRISI this year is November 29th, and that is 5 p.m. Eastern time. So applications must be submitted through grants.gov by November 29th, 5 p.m. Eastern time. That is the Monday after Thanksgiving, so we are certainly, advising folks to get your applications in early. It might be hard to get answers from either FRA staff or grants.gov technical support. Obviously, Thanksgiving Thursday, Friday, a lot of people are not in the office. Then you have a weekend, and then one day on Monday that you'd be able to get folks again. So my advice is, if possible, get your applications in prior to the Thanksgiving holiday, get it off your plate, and enjoy your long weekend. Additionally, within the NOFO, you'll see the FRA contact information. It describes the program and all the different set-asides and tracks, the required documentation to apply, and just what is our review process once we receive an application. We walk through that criteria in the NOFO as well. Next slide, please. Couple things here is 3 of these you need to complete in advance of being able to submit your application through grants.gov. 2 of them should be done fairly soon. In order to submit an application through grants.gov, you need to have a Duns and Bradstreet number, often just called the Duns number, in the federal grant community. It can take 2 to 3 weeks to get that. You need to register in the federal government's System for Award Management, often referred to as SAM. Again, it can take 2 to 3 weeks to get a registration complete in SAM. If you don't have either of those things, a DUNS or a SAM, then you will not be able to apply for the grant. And simply telling us that you ran out of time or were not able to complete your registration is not a reason for us to extend the end date for the announcement. So if you're even thinking about applying for one of our grants under the program, please start the DUNS and SAM processes now. Again, you can just go to Duns and Bradstreet's website or www.sam.gov to do these 2 processes. Do them now. If you're thinking about doing our grants or even any other federal grants, you need to have this anyway. Duns and Bradstreet is a one-time deal. SAM.gov is an annual registration. So once you get your initial registration, it's just once a year you go in to update it. If you have those 2 things within grants.gov, you would set up an AOR, Authorized Organization Representative profile, and that's essentially giving someone authority to go and submit that application on behalf of your organization. If you have those 3 things lined up, then you are ready to submit an application through grants.gov that outlines all the requirements in the NOFO. Next slide, please. And we have can you pull up the next slide here? So this is FRA's website. We lay out the competitive grant process here. Specifically, I just outlined some of the, in the yellow there, I know it's gonna be hard to see, but that's our pre-application information. It's Duns Bradstreet SAM, grants.gov registration. Phase 2 is, you're gonna read the NOFO, you're gonna respond to all the required documentation from the NOFO and submit through grants.gov. And then on the back end, we're gonna do a review of your applications, and those that are selected will be go through an awarding process, which also can take several months from the time you're selected to receive an award till we actually obligate that award. Sometimes there's some prerequisites to be met. NEPA, in this case, you need to have railroad agreements. Make sure you read about the 22905 railroad agreements that are often required for CRISI grants if you're going to be working with a railroad and you do not own the right of way. So those are some prerequisites that often are done after selection, but are a hold up before we can actually obligate your grant award. Next slide, please. So with this funding available, we do anticipate making multiple awards. As you'll see in the law enforcement and the suicide prevention, we put maxes on there, so we know we can get several awards within that carve out. Same thing there with the 25 million. Even though we don't have a max award, we anticipate that we shouldn't be able to allow us to make multiple awards under the 25 million for engineering and construction solutions. And all eligible applications most likely will not be funded. So this is where you really have to make the case in your application. What are the benefits of your application? Oftentimes we have many good applications that do not get funded because we are, funding the best of the best. Some projects may require more funding than is available. If you have a recipient or local match or share to put in, certainly make that known in your application. Sometimes we say we can't fund an entire project, but we would fund a portion there, 50 or 80% of it. And if that's acceptable to the recipient, then we would go ahead and make an award to that degree. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, and that was my last slide. So sorry, I'll actually hand it back over to Mike or Monica to do our next introduction.
No, thank you very much, Matt. And one thing I want to add to a couple things. Number one, the CRISI program is for the entire country. Yes, this webinar is focused on Southeast Florida, but that was by design. We originally were going to have an in-person event a few months ago before the CRISI program was released, and we were just going to talk about issues in Southeast Florida. Once the CRISI grant was released, I felt it was very important, or the team did, that we do discuss a funding solution since this grant is open. So I would like to make note that grant, all these grants we have talked about that Matt explained in detail, is open to the entire country. It's not just open to the Florida area. Also, I'd like to make note to everybody that when we are talking about the 25 mil CRISI grants and then the non-CRISI grants, when you are looking at the NOFO, feel free to search non-CRISI grants. That'll nail down for the law enforcement agencies that are just looking for police overtime and salaries, along with the suicide prevention folks. When you are looking at the 25 mil, that is a CRISI grant, as Matt mentioned, which will require some extensive paperwork. I strongly encourage you to follow the CARE model that Marco da Silva mentioned earlier, which is posted on FRA's website, when determining what type of engineering solutions you need. Simply filling out an application saying, yes, we have a trespass problem. Yes, we want engineering solutions. Give me 5 million, we'll figure it out. In a competitive grant process, you may not get too far. So please look at the CARE model. We kind of tell you step by step how to develop or determine these types of tools. Also, I want to highlight, you've heard a lot today about engineering and the law enforcement. The Federal Railroad Administration, along with our safety partners, we do focus on the 3 E's. One of the E's you haven't heard much today is education. When we originally planned this webinar, we planned for a whole day event down in Florida, and education was a huge piece of this webinar. Because of the Chrissy grant and a few other things, we kind of scaled it back to the 2 hours to talk really about money and solutions. Education is a solution. Our friends at Operation Lifesaver have state coordinators in every state. So if you are looking for an education component to any of your outreach that you're doing, Florida does have an Operation Lifesaver coordinator. You can visit oli.org, and on there you can follow the or navigate through the website to find the state coordinator, who will provide you with as much information you want. 46 of our states have a state coordinator, also, and DC. So these folks are made available for you anywhere at any time. They also provide free rail safety education programs to anybody, kindergarten kids, first responders, anybody that needs it. Operation Lifesaver does have a tailored program. Worst case, you can always reach the president of OLI through her email that's on the website. Rachel is an excellent person to work with and a great communicator, and she will respond to emails. I know sometimes when we reach certain individuals, they, larger agencies, you never hear from them, but Rachel is very hands-on and will definitely reach out to you. Before we move on in our closing, I would just like to review some of the questions that were posed in our chat, as FRA's team has been kind of overseeing. One, can Section 130 funds be used to implement pedestrian gate skirts? Our team, Deborah Chappelle, kind of works with our federal highway partners to oversee or talk about the Section 130 program. The Section 130 program is a federal highway program, and if you have a specific question on that in the chat, I will put Deborah's email, or you can go onto Federal Highway's website. They have a whole Section 130 program. So I really can't answer if it will just fund pedestrian gate skirts. They would have to look at your entire application as the totality of it to see if it's going to be able to reduce your issue or help out. So there's really no straightforward answer on that. Do any of these measures that I'm sure you heard Marco and others talk about require FRA approval? Now, the answer is no for our railroad trespassing things. However, when you're dealing with certain things, yes, you need the railroad's permission. You're on their property. You need to work with them. Most railroads, probably every railroad, will be a willing partner to work with the cities, states, whoever it may be, local communities, to reduce railroad trespassing, and they will look at every option. But one thing you must keep in mind, that there could be a local city, state ordinance that could prevent something. Say if you want a fence installed, some cities regulate the height, color, and those types of things. So there could be local ordinance that apply. So please keep an eye on that. Another question we have, does FRA routinely, when we get information from railroads, receive information on trespasser strikes on the condition of the trespasser if he or she was intoxicated? It is not a normally asked question. Some railroads provide that in the narrative. However, FRA did work with its contractor to conduct 2 demographic studies. The most recent was in 2013, where FRA looked at medical examiners' reports to see if intoxication played a key role. And I will say in our findings, yes, most folks that were struck by a train were intoxicated individuals. However, you have to read the whole report and look at it. And I believe the URL for the report is posted in the chat. Somebody asked about blue lights. Has FRA looked at the blue lights for the suicide prevention? Scott Cabri, are you still on? I'd like to call you out on that if you don't mind explaining a few on that.
Yeah, I'm here, Mike. Sure. So I maybe don't have too much to say, but I can say that there's been a number of different studies on blue lights and the impact of them. I think a couple of them in Japan, which have had some mixed results. I think initially thinking that there was a really positive outcome where it reduced suicides by quite a bit, but then a follow-up study indicating that it wasn't quite as powerful as they had thought. And I think it's been piloted in a couple other places. But I think along with the comment about the blue lights was the idea of trying to think a little bit more with psychologists or clinicians or people who might understand how to impact the psychology and mindset of someone who might be thinking about taking their life. And I think that's an important thing to consider, perhaps as some of this moves along. That might be an avenue of research to dig into a little bit more.
And one person we have not heard from, Dr. Blue. Dr. Blue oversees our human factors section when it comes to railroad trespassing and grade crossing. And to put you on the spot, Dr. Blue, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Scott highlighted the main points. I do think that it's a great question, and there's a lot of information that is out there on kind of behavioral modification. But within the rail domain, I think one of the things that we'd want to do is first kind of identify, if there's in the group of suicide, the group of individuals who are contemplating suicide, is there a specific kind of or subgroup that will identify the rail, and why would that be? And then tailor, things to meet their needs. I think there might be some nuances there that we want to consider in creating behavior modification strategies and things like that. So it's a good question. However, there's so much more information I think we need to get in and to tailor some programming to the population that's taking their lives on the rail.
Thank you very much. Before I jump to the question on trespassing homeless encampments, I'd like to real quick introduce Rachel. Rachel's a president of Operation Lifesaver, and she joined us today. Rachel, do you want to chime in real quick and say 2 words?
Sure. Thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank everyone on the phone. I know I have several partners on the call with us, and thank you for everything you do every day, helping us get the rail safety message out, and especially this week during Rail Safety Week. Feel free to reach out to me directly or any of our staters as much. We've got programs in the District of Columbia website, oli.org, or you can email me at M as in Mary, L as in Larry, @oli.org. And don't forget, later this week, wear your red for Red Out for Rail Safety. Thanks so much, and thank you, Mike and James and Mike Long and Scott and all the FRA staff and Monica who are on this call making it happen. Thank you.
Nope, thank you very much, Rachel. And I did put in the chat Rachel's OLI website. In reference to homeless encampments, this will be the last question I touch on before we close this out. In some ways, we did touch on it. We maybe didn't mention the word homeless encampments. However, some of the treatments that Marco discussed kind of have to look at homeless encampments. Some of our low-cost solutions, such as clearing vegetation, making a field in an area where there's a lot of overgrown shrubbery, sometimes helps that situation out. This situation, though, really depends state by state. As we found in some states, when the railroads go in to remove trespassers from their property that have set up an encampment, they have to secure their belongings from anywhere from 3 to 6 months. They have to sometimes provide these folks with another place to stay. So that really becomes a very tricky situation, and most railroads, local community leaders, and others try to work together. You have to be careful here. We did find out one situation that a city said, stop, wait a second, we know where the homeless are. Let's work together to provide them alternative housing because the homeless shelter was full. So we don't want to put anybody else's lives in danger. In other words, take them out of one dangerous situation and put them into another. So when you do look at the CRISI funding, there were some past grants that do look at homelessness encampments as part of the 25 million set aside we have, such as Worcester, Massachusetts. A lot of homeless encampments were right near the tracks. FRA, along with the city government officials in Worcester, Massachusetts and CSX Railroad, worked to demolish a building where the homeless were living. That building was right adjacent to the railroad tracks and caused a lot of issues for railroad trespassing. So these fundings here can be tied if your application can support the need for this. If you have any additional questions, please put them in the chat and our team will do its best to try to answer those for you. Before we close this out, I would like to welcome Allie Soul. She is the Vice President of Community Relations at Brightline Trains and has led the for 9 years. She has more than 12 years of experience developing, executing strategic public affairs, government relations, and public relations campaigns for privately funded startups, state agencies, cities, and counties. Allie's received several awards for her leadership and work in the public relations area. When FRA started having this conversation, Allie and her team jumped right up and said, how can we help? We want to be part of the solution. And I will say just about every railroad that we spoke to in your area jumped right up and said, we all want to be part of the solution. But I'd like Allie to touch base real quick to talk to the group as Brightline's going to be starting up here shortly. Allie?
Thank you, Mike, so much. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And we appreciate just taking 2 brief minutes of this presentation to address the group. We also appreciate the partnerships with many of the cities, counties, and law enforcement agencies who are on this call, as well as Rachel with Operation Lifesaver. We were just notified that we received a grant to extend our BuzzBox campaign. So we're very grateful, but we still have a lot of work and we look forward to doing it with the community. So as it relates to Brightline, our service will resume in November. We are currently on the corridor testing the trains, going through the testing for the positive train control, which will be fully installed and approved when we resume operations in November. And that PTC installation has occurred between Miami and West Palm Beach. Other safety improvements that we've been working on while we have been temporarily suspended include the BuzzBox, as I mentioned. That first picture underneath our trilingual rail safety pledge cards is a picture of our BuzzBox. It's a mobile barbershop on wheels that goes into underrepresented communities like homeless shelters, youth organizations, and finds a way to connect with those participants. In exchange for a free haircut, they have to take the rail safety pledge and obviously learn about rail safety and why it's so important to stay off the tracks. We just concluded a community greening project in Palm Beach County in partnership with Community Greening, where we installed about 3,000 native plants and fencing in select locations that will beautify the corridor, but then also work to deter trespassing. We have partnerships with law enforcement agencies along the corridor, good, strong relationships with the 3 South Florida school districts that have our materials and have distributed them. And we are also going to market with PSAs and then, of course, our trilingual safety materials, which we have and are able and happy to share with our city and community partners along the corridor to help us get the word out. So that is it from Brightline. We also, one last thing, we have an grants manager who is also happy to work with cities and counties or agencies if you do seek to go after these funds. So we look forward to continuing our partnership, and we thank you very much.
No, thank you, Allie. And I'd like to really do a shout out to all the railroads in Florida that helped us develop this webinar, helped us talk about hosting an in-person trespassing summit to raise awareness of this issue. I can't stress enough that this is really a community issue. The railroads, they're one piece. Without your help, your assistance, we can't drive these numbers down alone. Today, we did talk about a lot of information. We will be posting all this information, our presentation, a copy of the video or recorded of this session, the questions on our conference website. On October 27th, we will be doing another conference up in the Chicago area, same format, but really dedicated to the Chicago area. So it is our intent to go around the country to do these types of webinars or preferred in-person events if allowed by local laws to talk about railroad trespassing, to highlight the dangers, to highlight the solutions that our research team has studied. Scott mentioned toolbox. We have a wealth of research. I don't like to see this research just sit on a shelf. So through these toolboxes, we are hoping that this will get out into your hands to be used to deter or combat railroad trespassing. Lastly, if you do have anything that you want to hear from the FRA, please put it in the chat, as we are looking at doing this event again in the spring, summertime. And we will be focusing on other issues such as, what are the railroads doing? You know, Brightline mentioned the buzz box. We will give opportunity to other railroads to let the community know, hey, we are doing things. We're not just sitting back. I know Brightline, Tri-Rail, Amtrak, CSX, you know, all the railroads that operate in this area have tried to do things. So we will highlight what they have been doing as part of our coming webinars. Kim, anything to say before we tie this off?
Sure. So thank you for the opportunity to play a role with FRA. As a local resource, this information has been tremendously valuable, and we'll be distributing it once FRA has the recording, the PowerPoint slides, and the FAQs to summarize. We'll distribute that to all of our local governments and agencies, and also send it through the Florida Regional Councils Association, so other regional planning councils in the state can distribute it as well. So we appreciate the chance to be a part of the discussion and assist, and we'll look forward to continuing to play that role as it's helpful.
Thank you. Again, thank you to everybody that participated. Everybody that registered for this conference did receive a confirmation email from my colleague, Monica Shaw. I will have to go to bat for her. The entire Washington, D.C. area lost their internet, phone lines, and everything about 5 minutes before this webinar kicked off. Some of our counterparts were on their phones to dial in. It was a national outage in that area. I guess the storm went through. So I want to say a special thank you to those folks that found a way to get on and still present seamlessly. So I do appreciate that. And thank you very much. With that being said, on behalf of the FRA, our friends at Treasure Coast, and all that participated, thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful day.